Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sasha Farbach. Marco Rubio and Sergey Lavrov have held talks in Manila on the sidelines of the ASEAN foreign ministers' meeting. The latest high-level contact between Washington and Moscow, as the United States says it remains open to a constructive role in ending the war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, Brussels has agreed a 21st sanctions package aimed at further squeezing Russia's war economy after weeks of difficult negotiations. Joining us now is Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies at University College Dublin. Good to have you back with us.
Thank you so much for having me here, Sasha.
So let's try and get some translation going for Marco Rubio. Now, not only this constructive talks that he said before this meeting, this is now past his meeting with Mr. Lavrov. There was a press conference after. And what stuck with me, he said, we are happy to help in a positive way. So what does that mean in practice to you?
What it means in practice is that you had a 35-minute meeting, which is effectively to check where everyone is. Because the United States pulled out of the Ukraine-Russia talks, and Rubio said back in May, we're not coming back in unless we see that progress is being made. Now, details on what happened today are sketchy, but Russian media are saying that Lavrov went in and said, we're looking for fulfillment of the agreement in Anchorage, which was, of course, the summit between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump back in August of 2025. Well, there was no agreement in Anchorage. What Putin did in Anchorage was demand that Ukraine give up the rest of the Donetsk region in the east of the country, and that the rest of the country be kept relatively weak with security guarantees that weren't meaningful. Well, Ukraine's not going to accept that, and the Americans did not, in fact, agree to that. To the contrary, they actually imposed sanctions on Russia that autumn because of Russia's ongoing attacks. So if Lavrov did go in today and say, fulfill the Anchorage agreements, Rubio is not going to do that. He's just simply going to say, okay, well, there's your demands that you've simply restated. I think what is also interesting, where we need further information, is that before this meeting took place, is that Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelenskyy spoke with Donald Trump's envoys, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, by phone. Zelenskyy hailed the call as being very good, very productive. Well, he said nice things about it. We don't know what actually was the substance of this. But let me add one other thing. Before Zelenskyy spoke with the envoys, and this may be the most important development, he spoke with the U.S. ambassador to NATO, Matthew Wheeler. And what was he speaking about? Ukraine trying to get American support for air defenses and the developing talks over a U.S.-Ukraine drone agreement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting you mentioned the NATO connection there, and in fact, also at that press conference, I'm reminded by it, he also acknowledged Pearl, so this program through NATO where U.S. arms are effectively being sold to Ukraine. So maybe there in some subtext, does that kind of hint to us there will be more military support, as you said, the air defense? Is that something going to come through faster now for Ukraine in any way?
It's certainly on the table, and I think you can see other signals in terms of what's happening. These talks on the drone technology are really important. They've been going on in months between Ukraine and American officials, and it's because Ukraine has developed this advantage in drone technology. Not just that it has drone technology, but in some ways the Americans can benefit from it. Then what you have also seen is that this shift in rhetoric from Donald Trump, believing that Ukraine is winning because of Ukraine's long-range strikes inside Russia. And then the other thing, which may play a factor here, is the shift in congressional opinion. With the sudden death of Lindsey Graham, who was a big supporter of aid to Ukraine, this may have shifted congressional opinion, at least to provide more aid to Ukraine, and indeed to put more sanctions on Russia. All of that does not yet mean a return to an American commitment to support Ukraine the way that we had it before the Trump administration, but it means that the possibility, I think, is greater now than it has been since earlier this year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned also the late Senator Lindsey Graham. That funeral actually going to come up soon, and in fact, President Zelenskyy will attend that funeral in the United States. So I'm just wondering, will that kind of present another opportunity? Will he meet Kushner and Witkoff, maybe other leadership from the administration?
It's always a possibility. I'm always reminded of what was one of the turning points to prevent a complete Trump cutoff of assistance to Ukraine, which was back in June of 2025, which was the funeral of Pope Francis. And of course, you may remember those photos of Zelensky and Trump, just two chairs in the middle of the Vatican Basilica. And this was important, one, because it meant Zelensky got FaceTime with Trump to put Ukraine's case, but two, it was stage managed. You could see that being stage managed as a sign that no, the Trump folks were not going to go, completely divorcing themselves from Ukraine. Here we are again, more than a year later, and I think you have that window for Ukraine, especially if you can deal with some domestic issues that it has right now, of actually presenting this strong case to the Americans, which is, why are you tying yourselves to the Russians? They're the ones that are on the defensive right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a point that I wanted just to ask you. I mean, if we look at Anchorage, that meeting with Trump and Putin, a lot has changed since then. If we look at the battlefield, also just the capabilities of what Ukraine is doing right now, just in fact this morning, more strikes deep into Russia, energy facilities. The Ukrainians are hitting that on a big scale. They have for months now. Does that also play into how Trump sees this war? I mean, he's already hinted at this jokingly at the NATO summit. Does this kind of, let's say, maybe tease a bit of more support and understanding on Ukraine's side?
Oh, I think it's fundamental in terms of the mood music around this. Remember, Trump was the guy who used to say that Ukraine had no cards, and therefore why should we, even care about them? Well, quite clearly, Ukraine has cards right now in terms of this sustained damage on Russian refineries. Another one was hit overnight, on terminals, on ports, on infrastructure, now on logistics hubs such as the Wild Berries retailer, which has suffered more than $4 billion in damage in the last week alone. And Trump may not know that much in detail about what, Ukrainian history or Ukrainian culture or Ukrainian economics. He may not know that much about Russia, but what he likes is he likes the pictures. And he likes the idea of being with a winner. And right now, Ukraine looks like it has turned the corner from resistance to counterattack, because on the one hand, it's not breaking under Russia's aerial strikes. And on the other hand, it's put Russia into a fuel crisis, and it's put Russia into under serious economic pressure.
Mm-hmm. Speaking exactly on that note, the operative word there, pressure, also on fuel, on energy. Let's just talk about that recent package that was finally agreed on today, on Thursday in Brussels, the European 21st sanctions package. I think one of the main things there is that this oil price cap is still capped and extended at $44.10 per barrel for the next 12 months. It took some time to get there, but how significant is that going to be in this decision in terms of the economic pressure for Russia?
Well, I think there's two issues from the sanctions package, which also included measures against Russian banks, against Russian crypto firms. The first is, it's one thing to declare an oil price cap. How are you going to enforce it? And that raises the question of Russia trying to bypass the sanctions with its shadow fleet. Now, the EU also announced today that it's taking action against vessels that assist the shadow fleet. So that's part of enforcing this grip on Russia's maritime exports. But also what's been instrumental closer to Ukraine has been that Ukraine has been absolutely devastating the Russian shadow fleet, almost 200 ships that it's hit since July the 6th. Now, the immediate effect of that is to try to isolate Crimea, occupied since 2014. But it also has a wider effect on Russian capabilities. But the second thing I have to say is not quite as positive. The EU watered down that sanctions package because of Greek objections. They were supposed to announce measures that prevented countries from re-exporting Russian energy supplies, notably LNG, liquefied natural gas. And that provision is not there because the Greeks objected. They, of course, have a very big tank, a whole fleet of tankers. They make a lot of money off of this. That, I think, raises a wider question, which is if you're really going to put pressure on Russia's energy sector, you don't just go halfway. So will the EU enforce that ban on Russia's LNG imports that is supposed to come in January 2027?
Mm-hmm. But on that enforcement, we've already seen, I think, some countries stepping up to that. I mean, not that long ago, it was the UK that sees those shadow tankers as well. The French have done the same. So I think it seems like there's a little bit more momentum in this. So I just want to get your sense as well, because you mentioned Greek objections, but we also have small victories, I would say, or for them at least. The Austrians with Raiffeisen Bank and also leaving a certain individual, I think the Bulgarians wanted this, Patriarch Kirill, off that sanction list as well. So what does that tell us about how complicated unity is in Europe on all this?
Yeah, look, it tells us, and this has been the case for the EU, going all the way back to when it was formed as the EC back in the 1950s, is that you have a tension between European interest and that you have a tension between national interest. So when you've got an Austrian bank, Raiffeisenbank, which could be affected by the EU sanctions, the Austrians are going to say, well, do we have to defend our own, as it were? The case of the Bulgarians, who are looking at someone who they see as being an important contact, being basically important for whether it's political or economic reasons, and they say leave that off. It's always going to be the challenge for the EU, which is to try to overcome those national interests. And as I said, I don't think those individual measures that we just referred to with Austria and Bulgaria concern me. The one that really concerns me is that question about Russia's energy imports. And that is, ban means ban. And by 2027, there are no excuses for the EU not to enforce this. Because I'll just give you one statistic. The EU imports of Russian liquefied natural gas went up 16% last year. They didn't go down, they went up. And look, when you've got Russia as an aggressor, the idea that you would increase your imports of LNG from it, well, it may make immediate sense in terms of your energy supplies, but it doesn't make any type of sense in terms of defending against the invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, and also I think the added pressure of what we're seeing in the Gulf with a lot of LNG for Europe, those levels are not where they were a year ago, so that adds to the whole level of conflicting and very complicated areas. Look, we'll have to close it there. Always a pleasure having you with us. Scott Lucas there, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sasha, and thank you, viewers.
And thank you for watching. That concludes World Talks, but do stay right here on TVP World for more. Goodbye.